All right. By my clock, it is 5:01. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And Michael Brown, welcome to NatSec Nightcap. Thanks for joining us today. NatSec Nightcap is the National Security Institute's bi-weekly webinar where we talk to national security leaders about the hot issues of the day. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Mike Brown, the Director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the U.S. Department of Defense. Uh, DIU fields leading edge commercial capabilities to bring those capabilities to the military faster and more cost effectively than traditional acquisition methods. Previously, Mike served for 2 years as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow at DoD. He's the co-author of a Pentagon study on China's participation in the U.S. venture ecosystem. Some of you have read that, even though it wasn't formally released. It actually serves as a catalyst for the reforms to the syphilis law, FIRMA, that were signed into law in August 2018, and were worked on actively by one of our NSI fellows. He also led the initiative for a new Defense Department-sponsored initiative, an investment vehicle known as the National Security Innovation Capital Initiative, to fund dual-use hardware technology companies. Mike is the former CEO of Symantec, a global leader in cybersecurity. So Mike, thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it. And I thought we'd jump right in by talking about what DIU is. So some of the people on our call may not know what DIU is. It used to be called DIUX. Tell us about DIU. Tell us about where it came from, and tell us about how you ended up here at DIU.
Great, thanks, Jamil, and thanks to you very much for having me. Yeah, Defense Innovation Unit was started by then Secretary Ash Carter in 2015, so we're coming up on our 5-year anniversary. And he recognized that a lot of the technology needed by the military in fields like AI and cyber is being developed in the commercial sector. So if the department wants access to what's happening in these fields, we need to be well connected with the leading edge companies in the innovation hubs around the country. So that was the idea behind DIUX. He called it experimental because he always wanted the organization to be trying new things. And a few years later, Secretary Mattis decided that he didn't want the organization to be confused, that it was experimental, and wanted to signal the permanence of DIU's value within the department. So he took the X away. And so now we're Defense Innovation Unit without the experimental, but we still keep that mindset very much alive within DIU. We tend to work on projects. The way we work is someone will have an important problem that the commercial sector can solve. Good example of one we're working on right now for the US Army. They like to be buying small drones that are not made in China. Those of you who know the small drone industry know that 70 to 80% of the worldwide market share is held by one Chinese company, DJI.
DJI, yeah.
Yeah, so they make a pretty competitive product, and the military has bought quite a few of those. Unfortunately, those products phone home, and so that's not a feature from the military standpoint. So the Army would come to us, this was a program of record, and say, what are the commercial sources out there of small drones? Who would have the capability within that market that fits what we're looking for? We do a competitive bake-off. We started with 6 vendors, and we hope that 1 or 2 of those vendors will make it to production contract. I feel confident they will. That will give the U.S. Army a allied source. We're working actually with an allied source as well as U.S. sources. And so that's an example of the kind of commercial technology that we want to bring to the military. And part of our hallmark is speed or sense of urgency.
Yeah.
So work to get projects done in 1 to 2 years, which is more on commercial terms versus traditional Defense Department procurement, which can take up to a decade.
Right.
So we want to field commercial capability. We want to do it faster. And in fact, what distinguishes DIU among the many different innovation organizations at the Defense Department is we go cross DoD, so we're not just limited to one service.
Right.
We exclusively work on commercial technology.
Right. Now, does DIU have its own budget for buying this technology, and then you ship it over to Army, or do you rely on Army's budget and you sort of help them find the right companies and connect them and sort of bring people together? How do you all make that happen? Do you have sort of a slate of companies you rely on? How does that work?
So from a budget standpoint, Congress does give us some budget, and that's to be able to supplement what the services might be able to do, or sometimes start a project that we know is going to have applicability that maybe a service is not ready to fund. So we can front load the process in that way. But 90% of what we procure comes from a DoD partner. So it's
Gotcha.
about 90% from DoD partners, about 10% from our budget. And in
Got
terms
it.
of working with companies, yeah, very important for us to maintain good relationships with not only entrepreneurs in some of these segments, AI, cyber, small drones, or autonomous systems being examples,
Right.
commercial space, but also the investment community and the incubators and
Right.
academia. So it's really, if you think about the concept in the National Defense Strategy called National Security Innovation Base, which is
Yeah.
meant to say we need to be drawing from the U.S. economy's wide collection of folks that contribute to innovative solutions. Then you got to be working in a much broader set of companies than traditional primes. That was
Right.
the idea behind that concept. So part of what we need to do is make sure we've got relationships with all those different elements and that we bring the best of what they're producing together and that for the military.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned China, you mentioned DJI, and sort of the capabilities they have, and you recently wrote a Brookings article where you discussed this sort of superpower marathon, right? This idea that the U.S. and China are fundamentally competing. It's an economic and technology race that's going to last not just the next 10 years, but generations. And you argue there's a lot of dimensions to this conflict, right? Political, military, diplomatic, alike. But the core of this is really sort of what you call geoeconomic, right? What does that mean, and how is technology and innovation at the core of that particular competition?
Well, if you look at you can't pick up any article today talking about the U.S. and China that isn't increasingly focused on the changing nature of the relationship. And we're in a competition with China. You can call it a strategic competition. The National Defense Strategy calls it great power competition. But the nature of the competition is evolving. The reason we call it a superpower marathon in the article that you mentioned that I co-authored is, one, among great powers, there's two that have economies that really put them in a class by themselves. The other elements of the great power competition would include Russia, but its economy now is smaller than Italy's. So China, if you measure their economy in local currency or RMB, is actually larger than the US. Most economists expect in dollar terms that China will have a larger economy sometime in the next decade. So this is the first time any of us alive have been in an environment where there could be a larger economy than the US economy. So that's a fundamental shift in the geopolitical scene.
Yeah.
The competition, we argue in the paper that this is not like the Cold War, which was about military competition. This is very much about economics, and China's clear part of their national agenda is to be the premier economic power, and they see the benefit of technology to help get them there. So
Right.
they're not be content to be making toys and shoes, to be an economy that's based on low-cost labor arbitrage. They want to
Right.
dominate the high technology industries of the future. That means space and satellites. It means advanced telecommunications we're seeing through 5G. It means small drones. We could go on and on.
Yeah.
That's the site that they see. And basically, they'd like to displace the United States as the source of those technologies. Those are where the high wage jobs are.
Yeah.
That's where the standards are determined for future industries. And that's a role they would like to play for themselves. So important for their continued economic growth is the underlying technology development and innovation to the economy. So they've set
Right.
their sights. That's why it's core to this competition.
Yeah. And can they, will they, are they going to succeed at this? I mean, it feels like, and I don't know if it's just the COVID environment or what we've seen over the last decade of them stealing our intellectual property and the like, they appear poised to be successful in this effort. Should we be concerned about that? And if we should be concerned, what can we do now as a country, in this moment where we're thinking about spending money and investing in COVID and bringing jobs back to the United States? What can we be doing that's smart to get ahead of this?
So we should definitely be concerned. I really view this as the national security challenge of our generation. They have made tremendous success. And a lot of that has been good for the world. They've probably elevated more people out of poverty than any economy in modern times, maybe 350 million people into a new middle class in China. That's all goodness. But where it comes to displacing us as the source of high technology, the determining country of standards for the future,
Right.
then we should be concerned, because the way they will be successful, if they are, is hollowing out the industrial capacity of the US and our Western allies. And of course, they have a very different view, as we've seen, of how they would like the world order to be than what we have set up since World War II. So
Right.
it represents a very different order in the world than what we've become used to.
Right.
Now, they have a mixed track record, so I wouldn't say they're not 10 feet tall. There's no a surefire way to do that without failing. So
Right.
it's not something that is inevitable. On the other hand, if we don't even recognize we're in a competition and don't even mount a challenge, that certainly improves their chances of being successful.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is a couple of things. One, recognize that this is a competition based on technology with the aim of succeeding economically. So if you want to be a leader in technology, you've got to invest in the fundamental science. And we've gotten away from that. As an example, our funding of R&D,
Yeah.
federally sponsored. So federal funding of R&D as a percentage of GDP is at a pretty low level, about 0.7%. That was 2% of our GDP at the height of the Cold War.
Wow.
In the 60s, when we were in the space race. And the key point there is there are a lot of spillover effects that accrue to the U.S. as an economy because of that investment we made. So if you think about some of the things we invested in during the space race, the internet, GPS, miniaturized electronics, which have led to the semiconductor industry, which have led
Right.
to PCs, the internet, on and on, or I should say the tremendous software industry that we have in the U.S. Those things would not have occurred without federal funding to get those
Right.
longer term, more risky investments going in the 60s and 70s. So
Yeah.
we need to recognize that if we want to be a leader in technology, we've got to invest in the science, and that requires some R&D spending, both federal government and on the private sector. We could probably do
Yeah.
things to increase, for example, the R&D tax credit to make the incentives higher for the private
Right.
sector to also fill in there. So that's number
Right.
one. Recognize we need to be the preeminent leader in science and technology and make the investment required. China is investing trillions of dollars to make this happen. Our investment is in decline. Number two, we got to have the talent. Where's our funding of STEM education and making sure that we've got the right talent, scientists, engineers? This was a big push of the United States in the space race. Now that's trailed off because we haven't had a superpower competitor in a generation.
Right.
We won the Cold War, so that gives us a little bit of hubris to think that in any future competition we'll win that. That's
Yeah.
also not inevitable or preordained. So I'm concerned we're not investing in the right level of talent for the future. We have a tremendous education system in the US. It's world-class, but of foreign students who are here taking advantage of that, 1/3 are Chinese foreign nationals. So we're
Right.
helping to educate Chinese foreign nationals in a lot of STEM fields. The third is to recognize a strength of China's, which is their integrated statecraft, thinking about the economy and the fact that they want to win. They put together all the elements of government, academia, and business together, and they have decided on national champions and particular technologies they want to be leaders in.
Right.
And they go after that. And a good example of them being successful is small drones, DJI. Another example, Huawei and 5G.
Right.
They have a national strategy for how they're going to be leaders in these game-changing technology of the future. AI, advanced telecommunications, quantum sciences, biotech. We don't have a national strategy. And I'm not arguing that we should be doing the same thing and copying them. But I do
Right.
think we need to recognize that there are a series of game-changing technologies around us. We've talked about them already: AI, space, cyber, quantum sciences. If we want to be leaders in these fields, we've got to think about how do we orchestrate our government, our academia, our private sector to be at least working together to make the right investments, create the right talent, be focused on the standards.
Yeah.
So that's a key thrust for us. And then the last one I'll mention is about our capital markets and business incentives. We have increasingly, since the 1980s, been absorbed in something that's called the shareholder revolution. to try and make our businesses much more efficient in terms of use of capital and more profitable. In the absence of geo-economic competition, that's a good thing. We've, in fact, made our economy more productive. But when we have a strategic competitor, a great power that we're competing with, we can't act as if that doesn't occur and then let industries migrate there to China, and then expect there's not going to be any supply chain problems, or if there's a conflict, that we'll be able to get what we need. We're seeing that right now in COVID.
Yes.
Because I think 97% of the antibiotics come from China. 80% of the ingredients in pharmaceuticals come from China. Well, now that's causing a little bit of concern among us in the US that maybe that's not a smart idea. The same thing occurs in other spaces. We already talked about small drones. We could go on and on. We've let our supply chain migrate to China because the world is flat and we can source from anywhere, wherever the lowest cost is. Maybe that's where we should go. That works as long as we're friends with everyone in the world. If we're not, there's a little more complexity to it than that. So we need to be thinking in the business community and the capital markets of how do we create the right incentives for the long term and recognize there is geo-economic competition out there, not be so short-term oriented, make the right investments so we develop future capabilities. That's going to be important for us to prevail in this superpower marathon with China.
Yeah. And I do want to talk about this last piece. I want to spend some time actually focusing on this question about how we create the right incentives, particularly as Congress and the administration are looking at this very issue of economic and strategic competition with China. They're looking at how to get our economy back prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that will come in the post-COVID environment. I actually will tell you I'm very bullish on our long-term economic success. I'm obviously very concerned about the immediate next year or two, but I think for folks that can make it through this period and can put capital to work smartly, I think there are real opportunities. And frankly, with the U.S. government getting involved and protecting parts of U.S. innovation, right? If they do it smartly and right and create the right incentives, this doesn't have to be a big government program of large grants. This can be the private sector coming in. We just have to create the right environment for it. So I'm really excited to talk to you about that. But before we get to that, one of the other points you've made, I know, and I know you've written about elsewhere, is it's not just the United States, right? We can't just do this in isolation.
Right.
We've got to work with our allies. We've got to have this longer-term strategy. How do you see DIU's role? You mentioned that you're actually working with some allied companies to help fill this small drone need. Tell us more about the way you see the need to work with allies, and how you think about that in the sort of the commercial, sort of corporate plus DoD context.
Sure. Well, stepping back for a minute before we talk about DIU, I couldn't have made the point better than you did. This is something where we need to be very much engaged with allies if we want to have a hope of influencing China's behavior and prevailing in this competition. It needs to be much bigger than just the US versus China. And we need to think about that both in terms of protecting technology. A lot of the work that I've been involved with, while I've called for more investment in basic science and what we can do from an incentive standpoint to stimulate technology, a lot of the work that I've been done has been used as a justification for more protection of US technology. That only works if we collaborate with allies. If we make sure that our investment screening mechanism, that of course happens with CFIUS, if our export controls are coordinated with our allies. If we don't, we just put the US at an advantage. So just raising the protectionist walls is not a good strategy for us. Makes our market smaller. We lose out on all the great ideas, talent, capital flow that we want coming to the US. So if you're concerned about the technology leakage outside the US, the key way to avoid that is to work closely with allies. Same thing's true on the investment side. There's no reason we need to be the only economy making investments in these future game-changing technologies we talked about. We need to be collaborating with allies. There's probably some larger role for the allies as a group to play on strengths. As an example, what is Japan's unique strengths thinking about these game-changing technologies? What can they be doing given their strong semiconductor industry that moves us forward in terms of higher density, lower power? They've got great expertise in advanced materials like ceramics that are very important for the future. So we need to be collaborating with our allies and figuring out how can we work together to make sure that we're making progress in these game-changing technologies, not just thinking that we need to do that in the US and then duplicating all that investment across different economies. To answer your question about DIU, let me come back to the a small drone example.
Hmm.
So what we envision is we need to, in order to have a competitive dynamic with China, which, as I mentioned, one company has 70 to 80% market share, we got to establish a viable set of competitors among the US and our allies. So what does that mean? We need to standardize on an offering, and we need to aggregate that buying power. If we stay splintered and take a typical laissez-faire approach, then it's very difficult for any of the allied competitors making drones to have enough of a market to basically sustain their position relative to DJI. So what we're doing, I mentioned the Army program. We're trying to aggregate the buying power of the Defense Department. So following along with the Army, the Marines are there, the Air Force is there watching what's happening. They're going to leverage that program and hopefully buy from the same source. And then we're going to put the winners of this bake-off that we're doing on the GSA schedule, so that when the Department of Interior needs to buy drones, when Customs and Border Patrol is buying drones, they're also buying from the same source. And then we want to work with our allies when we do foreign military sales to highlight the winners of this competition as well. There's no reason why our allied militaries are not also buying the same source.
Right.
And why doesn't that extend to local, state and local law enforcement? So the idea is, how can we aggregate the buying power and build up? We were a little bit asleep at the switch to let DJI take that much global market share, but we don't have to live with that situation. So what can we do to, again, standardize the offering and aggregate buying power so we can create effective competition for DJI?
Right.
So that's an example of what we can do working with allies to change the competitive dynamics and contribute to US and allies having the upper hand in the superpower marathon.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think bringing together sort of our allies, not just from Europe, but also just here in the United States, and there are a lot of people who might buy in this space. It makes a lot of sense to do that, and frankly, to give them an opportunity to buy for somebody other than DJI, because in the absence of that, right, the tendency will be to go the low-cost provider, because as you pointed out, rightly, that is sort of our normal economic sort of approach to these things, and it makes sense. So I'm interested to talk, though, about, we mentioned at the top that you had worked extensively on this report that DIU had done about the technology transfer efforts and China's involvement in the VC and venture-backed startups and the like. And actually, Dave Hankey, who worked for Senator Cornyn on the syphilis reform, is on the call. One of our fellows here at NSI. And you wrote an article recently about China's technology transfer strategy, and you talk about how their participation in venture-backed startups is at record levels now, 10 to 16% estimated of all venture deals. And in particular, in the last sort of less than a decade, about 7 years, has really grown dramatically, right? What do we know about their larger plan, right? Their multi-decade plan to move technology and to get into bringing technology. We know that it's not just venture-backed startups. We know it's not just it's not just R&D theft, although there's a lot of that going on. We know that when American companies want to come and access the Chinese market, they require joint ventures and sort of take technology there too. What is this whole plan they're doing, and how are they trying to really juice their economy through this effort?
Well, first, I'd like to give a shout out to Dave Hankey, because it was our collaboration when he was National Security Advisor to Senator Cornyn. We talked about the issue of Chinese investment in early stage technology. That certainly caught his attention. And then it was really a tremendous experience for me to work with him on what we could do for FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. So Dave Hankey deserves a tremendous amount of credit for really being the person that shepherded that. I got to see, what does that look like to see legislation become law, and he did a tremendous job.
Well, what's amazing about that is, I actually said, when Dave told me that they were considering doing the syphilis reform, I literally told Dave, I was like, there's no way you're getting this thing done. It's way too hard, way too complicated, too many interests, too many American companies that are worried about syphilis review, too many VCs, frankly, that have, Chinese LPs are going to be worried about this. I mean, I told Dave there's no chance on God's green earth they're getting this thing done, and he and Senator Cornyn and the whole crew in the Senate there. I'd just come off the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, and I told him there's no chance, but it really is amazing. A real credit to you and him for getting that done, Senator Cornyn.
Yeah, thanks. So to your question, if you think about China's strategy that we've already talked about, they really want to be the leaders in the high technology of the future. They stepped back, and the Communist Party really thought through a comprehensive approach to transferring technology to China. And that was one of the interesting things that came out of the DIUX report that you just referenced. Yes, I think the headline was definitely the fact that they were in a lot more early stage deals than we thought, a perfectly legal means at the time of learning about our technology. And of course, I should point out that that's a big problem for the military, because our military's advantage, at least since World War II, is based on technological superiority. We have it, the adversary doesn't. Look at what happened in the first Gulf War with the satellite-based communications, ISR, laser-guided munitions, night vision, on and on. We're able to defeat the 6th largest army in 6 days with very few casualties. And China was watching. They definitely noticed that technology was the way to prevail in a conflict and have the superior force. It was just 10 months later that the Soviet Union fell. They were watching again. And I think in both of those historical scenarios, they were saying, and this is not going to happen to us.
Right.
Our guard is up. We're getting the technology, and we're going to be very conscious of what were the things that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. One of which is probably the liberalization of values that came with Glasnost, and you saw with Tiananmen Square having just happened 2 years before, their move inevitably from that point, it wasn't inevitable always, but from that point saying that's not going to happen to us, and we're going to make sure that we've got control of the society, and they're using technology and the media to have more control over a larger number of people than's probably ever happened in history.
Yeah.
Right? But they're also saying from a technology standpoint, we need to make sure we have the technology we need to be the superior force. And so from that point, they have launched on the most comprehensive, systematic way of transferring technology that we could probably envision. And since we don't plan things centrally from the government on down, we don't think of things in these terms.
Right.
But we identified 10 in this DIUX paper, 10 different technology transfer mechanisms. Only 2 of them were illegal. The only ones were illegal, which they engage in with reckless abandon, cyber theft and industrial espionage. Well, there've been plenty of things written about that they're engaged in both of those activities on a scale that is unparalleled, either historically or relative to any other country.
Yeah.
And we've seen so many examples of that in terms of General Alexander saying this is the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. FBI Director Chris Wray talking about the fact that there's 2,000 espionage cases open right now that are about Chinese industrial espionage. So this is rampant. Yeah. But the other transfer mechanisms were all legal. One of which was the early stage investments. One of which is Chinese foreign nationals who are here studying for master's or PhD degrees in fields that are going to be important to national security. So we're highlighting that. There have been other cases in the category of industrial espionage that involve students stealing technology that the Defense Department has sponsored, taking that back to. There's a tremendous number of professional associations. I think CSET just did a report I just saw this week on the number of Chinese professional associations, which are billed often as networking opportunities for our engineers and scientists, but really are recruiting activities.
Right.
There are the talent recruiting activities specifically, 1,000 Talents, Spring Light. How can we get experts in technology back to China? Or if they're not willing to relocate, how do we offer some incentives for them to come back and set up a lab, teach a class, train some students here for a short period of time? So those sorts of things. Come give a talk on a sensitive technology area. And many times we haven't been as conscious of what's happening to educate our academics to know that there's a concept of deemed export controls. We shouldn't be talking about things that are basically an export control technology.
Right.
So it includes our investment banks and lawyers, Chinese firms doing business with those firms so they can understand what the landscape looks like for where key technology is being developed. So there were 10 different mechanisms we identified in the report that basically said this is comprehensive and systematic. They've looked at many different ways to bring not just IP that would come from cyber theft, but how can we buy IP legally? How can we buy companies? How can we make sure that we are doing the most to get the know-how and the people to China so they can take advantage of stolen IP? It's not just about IP. So they've really thought about this in a very careful way.
Yeah.
And are devoting tremendous amount of resource in these various mechanisms. I mean, just as one example, in the cyber theft area, they have 250,000 members of the PLA, the Chinese army, who every day go to work and are trying to steal valuable information from our companies so that they can give those to the Chinese champions the Communist Party has favored. And then they get these nuggets that then they're allowed to use to develop more competitive industry.
It's wild.
So it's a massive effort, and it's, in my opinion, not that well understood or characterized. In fact, I could argue we don't even have enough resources dedicated to understanding how big the problem is. It would be very difficult to with a lot of precision, quantify how much of that transfer is occurring. We got the comment from General Alexander we referred to. The IP Commission has done some work to say, oh, it's on the order of 300 or 500 billion per year. The truth is we don't know. We don't have the resources from a counterintelligence standpoint to even know how big this transfer is, but it's massive.
Yeah. So, one of the things, and by the way, I want to mention to the audience that we will be turning to your questions here in the next about 8 or 10 minutes. And I noticed there's already 8 questions in there. So please put your questions in the Q&A function down below. And we'll go through some of them as we get to the last 20 minutes of this call. I do want to turn for a moment, though, to this issue of the National Security Innovation Base, right? You spend a lot of time working on these issues, both in your private sector role at Symantec, when you were writing this, doing this work on venture capital with DIU. And now you're actually running sort of a program in the Defense Department to look at dual use technologies and figure out how the government can help fund some of that, can help create the right incentives for that to happen. Help us understand, how we come out of this this downturn. We've got the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got the economic downturn that's come alongside of it. I've laid out the argument for why there might be opportunities coming out of this. What is the role of startups in these opportunities? What's the role of the government in terms of this National Security Innovation Capital Fund that you run? And how does it relate to the Trusted Capital Initiative at DoD? What's the relation between these things? And will it play a role, frankly, in the COVID resurgence, and particularly on our ability to innovate technologically and keep the national security edge?
Well, great question, Jamil. So I would say that first, COVID is going to have a negative impact on this concept we call National Security Innovation Base. If you think about it from an investment standpoint, the small companies that are trying to make it through this period, many of them are under some financial duress. I'll highlight the commercial space supply base as an example. China is already launching more rockets every year than we do. We're trying to get a lot of help from small commercial companies that support the larger example rocket companies like SpaceX, which of course, very successful year. That requires a lot of suppliers, and they're under pressure right now as we go through this economic downturn. So probably some shrinking will occur, and there's some things that the US government could do to help offset that shrinkage that would naturally occur. But COVID in general will have a negative impact on that. And we need to be aware that we probably need to step up and do some things, because China is going to do everything they can to step on the gas during this period. We're already seeing what we'll call adversarial capital come into the market when one of our key suppliers is under pressure. They'll be looking for a way in. We've already seen that one example from China and one from Russia that's happened in the space commercial base. So when we look at what do we need to do as a response, the government needs to be conscious of the fact that longer term contracts are going to be of benefit here. So anything we can do to step up and provide that visibility and maybe some cash up front when we structure the arrangement with companies would be a big benefit. But longer term, we need to think about what are we doing to invest in this capability. So the government has not taken an active role, and I think it's time for us to be a little more active. We need to make sure the right incentives are there. That's probably the primary role of government. The federal funding of R&D that we talked about before spawns lots of new industries and companies. So that's a key effort that I think we need to be engaged in. And then when I say take a more direct effort, thank you for referring to something that I worked on after the time with David Hankey and working on protection. I was still focused on what can we do to build this national security innovation base? What can we do proactively, not just from a protection standpoint? And we devised the idea of a fund that would help catalyze private investment for dual-use hardware. So if we look at the venture industry in the US, we see most of it is now focused on software. Most of our big market cap wins have been in the software space. But the military still needs, and as a country, I'd say we still need hardware. We still need batteries. We need advanced materials to make things out of. They use either hypersonic missiles or jet aircraft. And these hardware innovations are often lacking for capital. If you have a good idea, it's not easy to get US venture capital for those, even though it's very easy to take in Chinese capital if you'd like to do that. That makes you a bit radioactive if you want to sell to the US government. So we need more on the helping side, not just the syphilis prevention side of taking in capital, but what we can do to stimulate that. So we proposed a $75 million fund for dual-use hardware. It was authorized by the NDAA, the John McCain NDAA from a couple of years ago, 2018, but no money has been appropriated by Congress for it. So we're still sitting at zero for that, but it's something I'd very much like to get going. So that's aimed at helping hardware suppliers get off the ground. How could we get them started with some of their early rounds so they can take an idea and develop it, and the company hopefully would be a supplier to the US military. You asked about trusted capital. That's another initiative from the Defense Department. And the idea behind trusted capital is how could we create an exchange? I've heard Secretary Ellen Lord call it a dating service between the investors who would be friendly sources of vetted capital, and the exchange would be with those companies who need the capital. So the idea would be, could we create an exchange where those two parties could meet, folks who need that money and vetted sources who can provide it. So that's a complementary idea, and both aimed at how do we broaden the national security innovation base.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those two things before we turn to audience questions here in a couple of minutes. On the first effort, the $75 million fund that was authorized in 2018, what's your sense of the prospects of getting that money appropriated in the current environment, particularly given that in the COVID-19 environment, the government is spending a lot of money to help the economy restart. There is this growing reliance, sort of recognition, I should say, of our reliance on China when it comes to PPE and pharmaceuticals, as you pointed out. And I think people are starting to wake up to the threat that China poses. It might be the one thing, frankly, that Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi can agree on, right? Is China bad, and China potentially a national security threat. How likely do you think is we get that fund funded, and how likely is it, in fact, we might expand that number? And really, because let's be honest, $75 million for hardware, you know this, having been a software entrepreneur yourself, I mean, $75 million is barely enough to get started. That might be a good opportunity to connect, bring more other VCs in, but that's not going to get a real hardware company, semiconductor industry, the like, I mean, get very far. So help us understand what you think the opportunities are, and is there an opportunity to increase that number in this current spending environment where the government is looking to do some things for the economy?
Well, I think you're right in terms of there being bipartisan support for what we need to do to stimulate the economy, and for what do we need to do to have an effective challenge to China in areas where we need to bring supply chains back to the US and where we need to develop new capabilities. So I'd say there's a growing recognition of this being important. And of course, there's a political reality of, while we'd like to spend even more to support companies in this downturn that's created by COVID, we also have the competing issues of an ever-mounting debt that the US is taking on, and the pressure on the defense budget. We've seen quite a bit of discussion in Congress, even with this NDAA, about whether too much is being spent for defense. One other positive development was in some legislation that's bicameral and bipartisan introduced that is called the Endless Frontiers Act. And it's focused on what can we do to really grow dramatically our federal investment in R&D, focused through the National Science Foundation. $100 billion to research and development, to add capability to our basic science work that's going on. So big proponent of that. So I'd say a lot of puts and takes, and there's a growing recognition that there's a need for this. So I'm hopeful that will result in some dollars that we can spend sometime in the future.
Right. Right. And then on the last piece on this trusted capital initiative, right? How does, if we got a lot of VCs on the phone here, a lot of folks that have invested in the past, a lot of entrepreneurs, if you're a company that wants to be on the trusted capital connection list, you want to supply to DoD and you want trusted capital, or you're somebody who wants to become vetted capital, right? One, is it open to just VCs, or is it also private equity and the like? And if it is, who do you talk to? Who do you go to? You know, I mean, try to get Eleanor on the phone is, you know, that's not happening. So there's an office. How does somebody get involved in trusted capital on either side?
Yeah, so the Defense Department organization, DIU, reports up to research and engineering. And a few years ago, that organization was created from AT&L, Acquisition Technology and Logistics. Right. So the other side for R&E is something called Acquisition and Sustainment. Within that is Industrial Policy. And they are the group that's running Trusted Capital. So there's a new DASD, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, that's coming in to run that. I don't think that person's been confirmed yet. Scott Baum is the acting DASD. I'm sure he'll be pleased I'm giving his name out over this call. But Industrial Policy, and he in particular, would be the person to reach out to. Yeah, they're very interested in growing that program.
Gotcha. Excellent. Excellent. Well, it's been great. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. So I see that I see Paul Trimble has asked a question about fundamental science, since we were talking about basic science just now. DoD's consistently been proposed cuts to basic and applied research, in her view, in favor of advanced technology, right? And those cuts have sometimes been restored by Congress, right? DIU's focus seems to be on the commercial sector. How can universities doing fundamental basic science work with DIU?
So at DIU, until we get National Security Innovation Capital funded, which I'm hopeful about, but we don't have it yet. When we get that funded, then we would be very interested in the relationship with universities as it relates to technology companies that might be spawned from university research. We're not in that position today. So DIU's main focus would be those companies that already have prototypes available. So probably less of a direct connection there today. The companies that we want to take forward and enable them to have larger supply agreements with the Defense Department need to at least have a prototype that we can vet and test in the military application.
Got it.
Hopefully increase that connection in the future.
Great. So we have one of my former bosses whose name I'll leave out of this, but wants to ask, do we think the academic and research community are sufficiently sensitive to the China problem, and frankly are sufficiently patriotic to help out? What's your experience with that?
Well, I'm not questioning anyone's patriotism. I think they're sufficiently patriotic, but I think we have to recognize that what has served us well in the academic community for years is a very open environment. Let's have an exchange of ideas. Let's bring the best talent together. So I think we need to recognize now that there have been enough violations of that trust that we place in everyone around the world, and start to implement some practices that I call closing the barn door. It just imposing some costs, making it not so easy for those who have malicious intent to come in and use our computer systems, walk into labs. So if there's sensitive research going on, we need to have some level of suspicion. There's been some work that's been done. I know Texas A&M has been involved in some best practices and shared that with other universities. So I think there needs to be more of a recognition that this is an issue, and a go-to guide, the best practices that help academic institutions make sure they're protecting the great work that they do.
Got it. So Dave Hankey actually has a question, and so he says he hopes you're well. How would you characterize the U.S. government's current reputation and relationship with startups and other small tech companies, not just in the Valley, but in Austin and Boston? And what can or should the U.S. government do differently in the coming years with respect to the startup community and frankly the VC community? We had some challenges in the post-Snowden environment with technology companies generally. Is that still a challenge? What about with startups and the like? What are you seeing, and not just in the Valley?
Yeah, I think there's still a little bit of overhang from the Snowden um, incident in terms of
Debacle.
trust, debacle, which we're still rebuilding. But I would say in general, the relationship has improved and is good. And I'll give you a good example of that. So when we go out and do solicitations for companies that we want to help on a problem, we're seeing an increasing number of companies come to DIU, and we're excited about that. So our average number of solicitations, average number of companies responding to solicitation is now at 31, and that's up 30% over the last 3 years. So every solicitation we do for a problem saying, companies, please come help, we're getting more and more companies respond. And the most recent one we did had 111 companies respond. So we're very excited about that. That means small companies want to work with the Defense Department. And this is not a question of motivation on the company's part. I think what's in our way here to see more of these solicitations where 100 plus companies want to respond is just making sure we can make it easy for the department to do business with these companies. There's an opportunity cost for a small company to spend time with the Defense Department.
Yeah,
and that's
ATOs.
That's right. You know it. That's exactly right. There's now a new cybersecurity management certification that may be involved.
Right, CMMC, right.
We're good at making the requirements more and more. So this is DIU's job. How can we make this easier and faster for companies to engage? So as long as we can solve that, I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to be able to source the best of what's happening commercially. And the other thing I would say is, while I'm very proud of the work that DIU does, we're still at a very small scale relative to the procurement DoD does. We influence about $500 million of procurement activity, which coming up from 5 years ago, we could be enthused about. But we have to recognize that DoD procures somewhere between 200 to 400 billion a year, depending on a year and what's being purchased. So that $500 million relative to that total number is very small. So if we really want to engage small companies, the investor community, academia, we've got to figure out how do we get more dollars flowing through that community. That's what's going to get folks' attention.
And how do you do that, Mike? How do you get more money coming to these small startups? And how do you, DIU is a fairly small organization within the larger Department of Defense also, probably batting outside its size category, frankly, but and above its pay grade. But how do you get more of these companies into the process? How do you get more money assigned to it? But then also, how do you reduce these regulations? I mean, we're just seeing more, right? Whether it's CMMC or the like, it's harder and harder for companies as we become more careful. It's harder and harder for small companies to work with DoD. Are you able to waive those regulations? Do you get authorities to operate that are easier to get? I know that there's use of other transaction authorities, OTAs. That's a tool that's been used in the past, but those seem to be sort of, on occasion when appropriate. If somebody gets lucky on a day that, where the sun is shining and the moon's in the 8th house. How does this work? I mean, can you all really do it? And how effective is it for these small companies?
Well, I think we can do it. We only use other transaction authority. That does give us some freedom on both moving fast and making sure that it's a very competitive process. We can't waive requirements, but imagine how difficult it is for any small company to solve these problems on their own as a one-off, versus if we can think of what we can do for a group of companies to make it easier. In other words, if we can show the way to easily get a certification for cyber or a continuous ATO, and we can put some manpower on that so that the company doesn't have to figure out who's the right person to hire. Does that mean they have to work with a prime? That's what our mission is. How do we break down those barriers? So we're continually figuring out what are the next set of barriers to knock down. How can we apply some resource and some intelligence so that we can make that easier for a whole class of companies to do. So that's very much what we're engaged in. To your question about how do more dollars flow there, we need to make sure that the services, so one way we, of course, give DIU more money in the budget. Okay, we'd be all for that, but not to be self-serving about it. if the services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, get some money allocated as part of an innovation budget that they could spend,
Interesting. Yeah.
that would accelerate, because often the problem, we find incredible capabilities out there being developed by the private sector and a need, end users in the military, and there's no money for it. And our budget process is frankly very slow and rigid, as most of you know on this call probably. And we need to think about, if we're in a competition with China, how do we get that moving faster? So to put an exclamation point on that, we're working now at the Pentagon on the budget for FY22. That means that if I'm programming money in the Air Force, I need to know in FY22, we're in FY20 of course now, I need to know 2 years in advance by line item, where am I going to spend that money? And that's pretty difficult to do in an innovative environment. I wouldn't even have prototyped a solution. I guess just to wrap up on that point, we need more flexibility so that as the services see a need, they could quickly say, this is an opportunity I've already prototyped and I need to put money on scaling that innovation quickly, rather than, that's great, now I can plan for putting money on that 2 years from now.
Right. Well, you know, one of the questions Harold Moss points out, one of our visiting fellows at NSI, that, you know, emerging technology innovation has been moving from, you know, the Bell Labs, the IBMs of the world, to these smaller innovative startups, right? From the, you know, Xerox PARC isn't what it used to be, right? And you know, how does it affect our ability to compete? I mean, you know, you guys are a small unit. You're identifying these things, right? You've got, you know, there are other, you know, there's Incutel, there's DARPA and IARPA doing some work in this space. But is there? I mean, well, one, is it how successful can it be at scale? Can we scale, right? Can DIU as an organization scale? And then second, how would you compare DIU's mission to the missions of organizations like Incutel, like IARPA, like DARPA? Are they complementary? Are they different? How do they work together?
So let's start with that. So very complementary. You could view Incutel and DIU as similarly working for the expansion of the national security innovation base. And of course, Incutel and IARPA are focused on the intelligence community customers. DIU and DARPA focused on the Defense Department. And as we know, there are defense agencies that are part of the intelligence community. So
yes,
it's not completely separate. And so it's important for us to have a good relationship, which I believe we do with Incutel, and reach out to IARPA and DARPA as well. Now, IARPA and DARPA are focused on longer term solutions. They're thinking about what is the technology we need 10 to 20 years into the future. DIU is focused on what can we deliver to our military in the next 18 to 24 months. So we're very focused on speed and what's available today that we can get out. So we have a relationship with DARPA and IARPA. In DARPA's case, we've taken winners of their grand challenges, competitions that they'll do to solve a tough problem. And we'll start working with one of those companies in developing a prototype. In that case that I just mentioned, it was a company that was able to automatically detect and remediate vulnerabilities in computer code that we're applying to weapon systems. Wouldn't it be great to be able to automatically see what are the vulnerabilities in code and how can we fix them automatically? So with certain types of code, we were able to do that with this winner of the DARPA Grand Challenge. That's another example of something we would do. So bottom line in your question, very complementary organizations. We're trying to work together. Very different timeframes with IARPA and DARPA from what DIU is trying to do.
Right.
And yeah, I do think we can scale if we're able to solve some of these problems that we already talked about, like the budget process and DIU's role. How can we continue to break down some of the barriers that small companies face in working with DoD?
It's great. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take probably 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll end up right on time at 6 o'clock for everybody. Shazeb Javani, one of our technology fellows, asks, when you talk about changing the incentive models to affect capital markets, can you give us some examples of places where it's been successful in the past, and what kind of incentives you might be talking about here?
Pretty broad. I think we need to examine everything from CEO incentives to the investors themselves. So we're very focused on what happens quarterly, CEO's compensation, what happens in a year, tremendous benefit to improving the efficiency of capital as opposed to developing long-term capabilities. So you'd really want to step back and rethink, how do the capital markets operate? Those folks who are, I'd say, preying on companies to make them more short-term oriented, and I'll pick out activists here, and say, is that a beneficial role for us in thinking about the role capital markets play in allocating resources in a competition with China? We need to be balancing that with, okay, what are the incentives for companies to be developing some long-term capabilities? And if you've ever run a company, what you see immediately is all the benefit to you in your own compensation comes from showing higher profitability and showing that quickly, and not patience for results, versus what can you do over a 10-year time period. Now, if we were sitting here and activists were on the phone, they'd say, well, that's how companies become big and fat. You focus on a long term and you don't have any short-term metrics. I think there's a balance that we need to achieve here. It's not all one or the other, but for 40 years, we've moved through the shareholder revolution to ever increasing short-term measures. And we need to start thinking about what are those long-term capabilities, and probably having some differentiation for what really moves economic and national security forward versus other economic activities that might be less beneficial. And those that do move our economic or national security forward probably are deserving of some increased incentive. So increased incentive would be something like doubling the R&D tax credit. You'd want to do that more for a company in AI or cyber, perhaps, than a company developing the next social platform, dating app, video game. So there's probably some differentiation that you could do there. Much more work that I think we'd have to do to develop that into a concrete set of examples. But hopefully that gives you directionally the way I think we should.
I wonder if there are tax incentives where you could incentivize longer term investment, right? And sort of, instead of sort of incentivizing the activist type of investment, right? Incentivize longer term private equity investment where it's sort of a buy and hold and really build strategy, particularly when it comes to these national security investments. And that might be something you lash up with trusted capital to do it. That sounds like a really interesting concept. One last question. Abraham Kang asks, why aren't we conducting disinformation against these industrial hackers? Why aren't we sort of feeding them bad stuff? Why aren't we sort of feeding them bad R&D to actually, undermine their capabilities rather than sort of, allowing them to steal the good stuff?
Yeah, I'm reminded of the fact that we did a couple of those successful campaigns in the Cold War with the Soviets, right? I think they stole a chip, and it eventually led to a pipeline blowing up.
Allegedly,
yeah. So that's a whole area that, of course, we can't discuss on the call, but let's hope some smart people are working on some things like that. DIU is not.
Gotcha. Well, listen, it's been great talking to you, Mike. It's been an amazing conversation. We've kept almost everybody here this entire time, so that's terrific. We're about to wrap up, so thanks for joining us tonight. Don't forget, by the way, to follow us on social media to stay up to date on everything we're doing at NSI. Please join us for our next NatSec Nightcap with John Demers, my former boss, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at DOJ. It'll be on Thursday, August 6th, 2 weeks from today, the exact same time, 5 to 6 p.m. ET. You'll find a link in the chat to register. At the end of the event, there is a short survey. Please complete it. Share your thoughts. We'd love to get your feedback. Thanks, everybody. Mike, thanks again, and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, Jamil.